Well, this is Saturn, girl, and please excuse me, I've been sick for like 2 weeks, so I haven't put out any content for a little bit. But I did want to talk a little bit about today, the astrology of May. So I wanted to go over, a couple transits that are happening and have just happened, and talk about what they mean for you also by doing your horoscopes. So this is an off the cuff, unedited, just, it's Saturn Girl freestyling here. I'm just riffing it. But anyway, I took a couple of notes. There's some important things that just friggin' happened here. So, yesterday on the 29th, Venus just entered her home sign of Taurus. And she's going to stay there until May 23rd, right after my birthday. And Mars today, just today on April 30th, when I'm filming this, went into his home sign of Aries. Yes. Amazing. Two planets entered their homes, their domiciles. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a minute too, because I just think it's worth saying for those who don't know. And then later this month, or rather later in May, at the end of the month, around the 25th, I think, Jupiter will enter Gemini. Yes, it'll be my season, Gemini season. It's wonderful, I mean, the rest of you probably think it's insane and crazy and all that sort of stuff. But what do I mean by domicile? And what do I mean by planets entering their homes? Well, planets rule signs, right? Venus rules Taurus. Mars rules Aries. Therefore, these are known as their domiciles or their homes. This is where these planets feel the most comfortable and express themselves in their most natural state, the most readily. If you know anything about dignity, which is the power a planet has, a planet is most powerful in their home sign. And if you follow me, you know that the zodiacal signs mostly get their meanings from the planets that rule them, and also their place in the solar cycle. In fact, you can look at a sign, and whether it's, air, fire, earth, or water, their element, right? You also look at their triplicity, right? Their modality, rather. So, cardinal, fixed, or mutable. Yeah. And you can look at their gender, right? Which is masculine or feminine or yin and yang or whatever you want to say, right? But these determine sort of how a sign expresses. And so what is Taurus and where does it get its meaning? It primarily gets its meaning from the fact that it's ruled by Venus, yeah? And so Venus very readily and very comfortably expresses herself here. Excuse me, I'm still getting over it. Please. And Venus most readily expresses herself right here. Now, Taurus is also fixed, and it's Earth, and therefore a feminine sign. Yes? And I think of this, right? Venus expressed through a feminine sign as being the inward-turned Venus. Yes? The more introspective Venus. Whereas the other Venus-ruled sign, Libra, is masculine, and therefore, like Venus turned outward into the social realm and all that sort of stuff. Right? Whereas Taurus is Venus turned inward towards our own pleasures and our own enjoyment. Yes. Taurus rules nice things, right? Venus is luxury. She's love and sensuality, pleasure and enjoyment. So we see these same themes echoed through the sign of Taurus. The same thing with Mars and Aries, yes? Aries gets a lot of its meaning from the fact that it is ruled by Mars. Excuse me. Mars in Aries is like Mars turned outward, right? Because Mars is masculine. It's a fire sign, right? And it's a cardinal sign, meaning it starts things. It begins things. Got to be starting something. Got to be starting something. Michael Jackson. Anyway. But Mars gives a lot of its meaning to Aries, right? Aries gets most of its meaning from the fact that it's ruled by Mars. But yes, the cardinal modality. And the fact that it is masculine, right, makes me think of it as Mars turned outward. right? Whereas Scorpio to me, as a feminine sign and fixed, is Mars turned inward. And we can see that sort of dichotomy, right? Because we think of, I do at least, I think of Mars and Aries as sort of like, the fighter or soldier that's attacking the outside of your armor and just, ah, ah. Whereas Mars and Scorpio is like looking for the little weak spot with the scorpion sting. You know what I'm saying? I always had this little joke that Mars turned outward in Aries is like action, whereas Mars turned inward in Scorpio is horror. The horror, for those of you familiar with Apocalypse Now. Excuse me. But then the other wonderful thing we have happening at the end of this month as well, right? The 25th, which is also right after my birthday, is Jupiter enters Gemini. Yes. And will remain there until June 9th of next year. Now, Jupiter is not fond of Gemini. We were just talking about dignity and domicile and rulership, right? Well, what sign does Jupiter rule? Sagittarius and Pisces, right? Now, Gemini is what? Opposite Sagittarius. So if Sagittarius is Jupiter's home, what is Gemini? In ancient astrology, they called it your exile. That's where you're exiled to, or where you feel exiled. We also call it detriment in modern astrology, particularly. And what it means is that a planet cannot express itself readily here. So Jupiter in Gemini is definitely a fun thing to look forward to for a lot of us. But the other thing we could see is that Jupiter being ill-dignified, we would say, or not happy, can indicate that the houses he rules in your chart may not have a wonderful time. And I'm not excited about that for me either, necessarily. But there's a lot to be excited about for Jupiter going into Gemini, especially if it's in a fun house for you. But Jupiter changing signs always feels, I'm like, Jupiter, right? I'm like talking too fast. But Jupiter changing signs, or any planet changing signs, is always momentous. But especially when it's a more slower moving planet, like Jupiter. So, anyway, Jupiter, we can think of it, right? This dichotomy of Sagittarius and Gemini, right? Being Jupiter ruled Sagittarius and Mercury ruled Gemini. I always think of it a bit about like the distinction between wisdom and knowledge, right? Wisdom is something where it's how things connect. It's knowledge is disparate. It's about facts. It's about experiences, all these little things, right? That we know, we come to know. But understanding is different. It's how these things interconnect and what they mean. So wisdom to me is about the way knowledge is applied and the way it affects other people and the way it reveals the interconnections and relationships about things and between them, right? Instead of the things themselves, it's the relationships or the connections between those things. And that to me is the distinction between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is just disparate facts, whereas wisdom is knowledge applied with intention. Now, it's up to you what that intention is. But that's why it's interesting to me why Jupiter can't express himself so well in Gemini, because he has to do with the deep things of wisdom, not the minutia of information and news and all that sort of stuff. I mean, I'm a Gemini sun, and last night I was literally watching the news on my phone and listening to a streamer on my computer, and then watching a movie casually on the television. So, that's mercurial stuff. Sagittarius doesn't usually like that sort of thing, And I was also tweeting while doing it, so. Go Gemini, right? Anyway, but these are very momentous things. This is a lot to happen in 1 month, especially my birthday month. Yes. So there is a lot to look forward to, but in order to talk about what this stuff means for you in particular, we have to do your horoscopes, okay? So I want to run through some very brief horoscopes for everyone for each rising sign. And remember, I always do these for each rising sign. Because that's what determines the houses in your chart. If you don't know your rising sign, I really suggest you find out your birth time and look it up. If you don't have a recorded birth time, you can watch for your sun sign, but you can always go to a professional astrologer for chart rectification. Right? Anyway, that's a whole nother story. And also, please visit my website, frankielynch.com. And also, please consider tipping me through YouTube Super Thanks. And also, you could donate to my Patreon to help me keep all this wonderful content going. And before we proceed, I just want to say, if you don't want to or can't donate, you can just watch all my videos. And you can try and, watch the commercials. I would really appreciate it, but they're awful commercials. When you make astrology content, they have all these stupid psychic nonsense things like, oh, watch Gaia TV. No. Watch science. Watch me. Watch things that are interesting and worthwhile, not gobbledygook fake history and fake science, right? I hate some of the commercials they have on my videos. It really, really irks me. But if you watch them, you don't have to pay me because the advertisers will. Anyway, now we'll go into your horoscopes, okay? And we're starting with Aries as per usual. So anyway, for my dear Aries Rising people, this means that Venus just went into your second house, and Mars just went into your first house. And you still have Jupiter in your second house, too. And he will be entering your third house soon. But when I think of Mars entering the first house, especially, Venus had been here for a while, making you feel sparkly and maybe even making you feel attractive. I mean, I met my partner when Venus was on my ascendant, so. But entering your second house is also a lovely thing, being that she rules it. And this is your house of money, finances, possessions, right? This is your stuff. So you could see little bonuses, right? You could see, a little modest influx of income from somewhere. That's always nice. Or it can make us want nice things. So just be careful. Hopefully you have the cash to back it up, because you really probably want to buy that new dress, or you want to buy, the, whatever it is, new clothes, shit, whatever. Excuse me. But it also makes us more aware of our resources, right? What we have at our disposal. Mars going into the first house, though, especially after being in the 12th house for a while. In the 12th house, it's like, don't touch me. Stay away, right? Don't. Yeah. But when Mars goes into the first house, it sort of lights us back up again. It makes us feel like, oh, I'm kind of special, right? It makes us aggressive too. So be careful that you don't, start stuff with people that you can't really take back, right? We might get a little arrogant. We might get a little boisterous and all that sort of thing, because we just came out of our cocoon for a little bit, And then Jupiter going into your third house at the end of May. See, this is great for when I went through it. I went through a lot of productivity, right? I was writing a lot. I was speaking a lot. I was making a lot of content and videos and all that sort of thing. So a lot of times we can see this really improve our communication skills, our output if our work involves those sorts of things. Or we can see our siblings get a bit of luck. We can see cousins, aunts, and uncles come back into our lives, right? And become an enjoyable influence on us. So anyway, but let's move on to Taurus Rising. So Taurus Rising, right? Venus just went into your first house after being in your 12th. And hopefully the time of her being in your 12th was healing. Yes, because that's what I think about with Venus in the 12th. And then going into the first house, this is your time to shine. I just said about our Aries peeps, right? That I met my partner when Venus was on my ascendant. So it's just, I'm not saying that everyone will, but it's when we feel more attractive. So take advantage of that. You'll want to sparkle. You'll want to put on some nice things, right? Try new things with your look, right? Try new things with your hair or whatever. Like I'm leaving my hair down right now, you know? I never do that because I hate my moldy locks. Moldy locks. I have frizzy curly hair when I don't straighten it. But I'm sure you all have lovely hair, Taurus risings, because, you know, you tend to. But this is a time of optimism, and it's a time for you to go mingle, right? Show yourself off. It's okay to be confident sometimes, as long as you're not acting like the silly valley girl who's like, ah, you know, I mean, I'm kind of that way myself, but, you know, you don't want to put people down in order to elevate yourself. That's not helpful either, right? Now, Mars entering your 12th house is not fun. One thing you have to be careful of is falling back into self-destructive patterns and self-destructive behavior. So if you've been, you know, if you have a past with bad patterns that cause you a lot of pain, you know, maybe they cause you a lot of pleasure in the moment and then a lot of pain later. But you really need to be careful of that stuff. And you need to set boundaries for yourself so you don't get sucked back in. Now, it can also mean that you really want to be alone and want to be left alone. Almost violently so, right? If people come and bother you, it'd be like, ah! You know? Pardon me, still sick. And I'm not editing this, okay? Well, anyway, why do you care? Well, let's move on in just a second, but I do want to say Jupiter moving into your second house should be pretty auspicious, right? Now, Jupiter rules your eighth house, so I hope it does give you some economic benefit, right? Because the second house, as I said, is your money and your stuff and yada yada. And so Jupiter entering in can often be either you have an influx of income that happens, or you get a new job, or something improves about your livelihood or your business. For me, I started my business when Jupiter was in my second house, you know. So here you go. It wasn't like I made a bunch of money or anything, but it was the beginning of a venture that was really, really special to me. So these sorts of things we can see too. You could begin an enterprise, right? Find a new job, as I say. Or, being that Jupiter rules your eighth house, it could be return on investments over the subsequent year until June of next year. So let's move on to Gemini Rising. Our Gemini Rising Hermes. So for Gemini Rising, Venus just entered your 12th house and Mars your 11th, right? Jupiter's about to go into your first, lovely. But when Venus enters your 12th house, it's sort of like, you know, she was in your 11th house. She may have worn you out. Maybe there was just so much going on, you know, and now it's like, time to crash and rest, hopefully. And I always joke about Venus in the 12th house as being sort of, especially when she's happy, as being representative of needing to drop bath bombs, right? This is the self-care kind of thing. If you got overworn out, right, or you tired yourself out, this is where you have healthy sort of seclusion, not the Mars type where it's like, you know, leave me alone. No, this is just like, it's enjoying your own company. Whereas Mars in the 12th house is like being annoyed at your own company almost, you know? So anyway, just, you know, learn to enjoy that time and to take time out and whatever. Sorry, fidgeting, you know. I should play with this instead. But Mars here in the 11th house, you need to be aware of a couple of things. So Mars in the 10th house before, you may have felt like, gosh, everything was just going wrong at work, perhaps. Or you felt like rejected from your job place or whatever. There were conflicts perhaps going on. And now you'll see those possibly bleed over into your social life. Because when Mars goes through our 11th house, which is what? Hopes and friends, aspirations. I should have been saying what each of these goddamn houses are, you know. First house is self. Yes. Okay. Anyway, I should just say as we go along. The 11th house is hopes and friends, particularly, mostly. It's optimism, right? It's what we want, what we wish for, right? It's the pleasures of the mind, all that sort of stuff. You see? And therefore our social life and the people who support us too. Like I think of fans and social networks and all that sort of stuff as part and parcel of the 11th house. So we could often get a lot of criticism from angry people. When Mars went through my 11th house, I got a lot of harassment, right? I got a bad rap a little bit, or, there was a sense of rejection a little bit. So just be prepared for stuff like that, because oftentimes it means fights with friends or your supporters, right? Or getting hate or antagonism from them. So just be prepared for that. I'm not going to bullshit you, Now, Jupiter going into your first house of self, this is you. The first house is the whole you, right? Mind, body, spirit. So Jupiter going here, number one, it can affect our bodies. Sometimes we gain a little weight, but, not everyone, and don't trip out about that. But what it does do a lot of times, because when Jupiter goes to the 12th house, it sort of forces us to turn inward a little bit and to take stock of our situation. We get contemplative. Sometimes it's quite painful, though. I mean, Jupiter's a very benefic or good influence, but it can be painful because it does force us to face things about ourselves that we've hidden or wanted to sort of ignore a little bit. So it can be a beneficial thing. And when it emerges, Jupiter, into the first house, then it's really sort of optimistic because it gives us more confidence. It makes us sort of expand into ourselves, not just physically, but our sense of self, And confidence comes from doing things, not just from assuming you can do them. That's arrogance, right? So confidence comes from accomplishment. And that's sort of the gift of Jupiter, right? It's not just the optimism, but also the desire to do these things. Yes? Whereas Venus is more pleasure. I think of Jupiter as the desire for success and achievement. Anyway, but, the ideas, like philosophical ideas, like altruism, in accomplishing things that mean something, right? I think of Saturn oftentimes as having to do with accomplishment, right? Jupiter's a little bit different. It's the idealism of accomplishment. It's a goal for a motive. Anyway, we need to move on to our Cancer Rising homies, but I just think you need to be optimistic, our Gemini people, Gemini Rising friends. But now we're moving on to Cancer Rising. So for Cancer Rising friends, Venus just entered your 11th house, right? After being in the 10th. So, and Venus in the 10th can make you feel seen. It can make you feel, it can make you feel like you're being recognized, right? That you're getting a bit of appreciation. Yes. And that's a good thing. But when it goes into your 11th house, it's sort of like that appreciation that you felt maybe spotlighted on you bleeds out, right? Not in a bad way. I mean, you share it, right? It has an effect on those around you. You feel more sociable. You feel like you can connect with people better. You perhaps feel a bit more optimistic about things. If there's something that you've been wanting to do, you start envisioning how you're going to do it. It also can show good press, right? If you have, if you do social media stuff, people could be more fond of you, right? You could be getting good feedback from people on projects or content or work that you're doing. And you could get some support from people too, whether it's, friends that give you help or advice about something, or people that want to support your work, whatever that is. That's all typical of this. But Mars going into the 10th house, oh my goodness. I think of this as fights at work, fights with bosses, fights with authority figures, fights with coworkers even sometimes, although that's more the 6th house too. 10th house more has to do with fights with authority people. Sometimes we quit our jobs too, or we have like these dramatic moments like, ah. I always say, none of you probably remember the movie Jerry Maguire from the 90s, but he goes like, I'm just going to freak out, right? And quits his job. And that's the sort of stuff I think of. It doesn't always have to be that dramatic. And oftentimes we do get a bad reputation. I mean, this here in the 10th house, I'd say more so than the 11th house, to be honest with you. Mars in the 10th house often makes us lose face. Or, right, we do naughty things. We do things that we don't want to be out there. Or things that make us feel a bit taboo or maybe even rejected, right? So that stuff does happen. And remember, the 10th house is your life direction, your career. It's what you're known for, right? Now, Jupiter's about to go into your 12th house. So now this will be a time when you have to focus on yourself and perhaps focus on past hurts or traumas. This is a time of reflection and healing. If you'd had any mental health or substance abuse issues, this is the time to address them. And it is a beneficent and benefic and good time. These are good occurrences for the most part, but they aren't always easy. And doing things that we need to do to heal, to take care of ourselves and to be the best that we can be for ourselves and for the people that we love, that stuff takes effort, and it can often be painful because we have to face our limitations. And Jupiter's about expansion, and it's also about expanding through these limitations. The 12th house is what? It's the house of self-undoing. Yes? Excuse me. Therefore, Jupiter coming into the 12th house is about self-repairing to me. Self-repairing. I just made that up. That was pretty good. This is all off the cuff, so, bear with me here. That's why I don't have a whole bunch of clever jokes that I made. I write some jokes for this, Excuse me. And please pardon all the stuff I'm not editing out. Pauses and coughing and stumbling over my words. So anyway, that's Cancer rising. And you have a lot to be looking forward to also. Just don't get yourself fired, right? And don't do anything that you don't want plastered all over the internet, right? Unless you're like me and you're a bit of an exhibitionist. So, anyway, let's move on to Leo rising. Leo rising, Hermes. So for our Leo rising friends, this puts Venus going into the 10th house and Mars going into the 9th house. And then Jupiter's going to go into the 11th house. I really hope Jupiter's been helping you with opportunities in your career or your advancement or your, whatever you do, your production, right? Your ambitions, your aspirations even perhaps. Because oftentimes we do see new opportunities happen in your job, right? We get promotions, we find a new position, all that sort of thing. Right, so I hope that did happen to you. Now, Jupiter going into your 11th house, even though Jupiter doesn't like Gemini, it's still pretty interesting that Jupiter in traditional astrology rejoices in the 11th house. It's a thing called planetary joys. And certain planets rejoice in houses. And Jupiter's in the 11th house. Remember, the 11th house is hopes and friends. So when Jupiter enters that house for you, you should see an expansion in the support that you get from others. Yes. Perhaps you yourself get a bit more popular or get some notoriety, right? We often see that because the 11th house is our social networks also. We see fame and things like that come out of the 11th house. I'm not saying you'll be famous, but you could experience being recognized and getting a good reputation, which is interesting because Venus going into your 10th house is also about recognition. And I always talk about Venus going to the 10th house as the time you need to get your resume in order, right? Because this is another time when new opportunities open up. We also see Venus going through the 10th house representing, female mentors or bosses or people who, give us a higher profile, give us some encouragement or write us a recommendation letter or something like that. So the 10th house is what you do, right? It's your life direction, what you're known for, your career, stuff like that. So a lot to be optimistic about. And then Mars is entering your 9th house here. And Mars just came out of your 8th house. So you probably spent more money than you would have cared to. Or maybe you lost money or did some silly gambling or something. Or maybe it just was paying your taxes. Maybe you had a big tax bill, sweetheart. But Mars going into the 9th house is going to make you very, very idealistic and very enthusiastic about what you believe. In fact, it might make you a bit of a fanatic or a zealot. You may be really, really interested in political or spiritual arguments. Those are the two typical ones, right? We also see the law, like sometimes it can represent getting in legal trouble, but frequently what I see is like getting into, religious or political debates and pissing people off. And sometimes, right, we even end friendships or family relationships or whatever over this kind of stuff. So just be careful with that because it is a tendency, just think of how worth it is. I mean, you don't want to avoid situations where you have to do what you think is right. Let's put it that way. You can't compromise your morals, but you can also use a little bit of tact, and you can not want to just throw away relationships over an argument you had over, Buddhism or something. I don't know. But let's move on to Virgo Rising. We got to move on quickly because, we still got some signs to get through. So for Virgo Rising, this puts Venus going into your 9th house and Mars going into your 8th house and Jupiter going into your 10th house. So Venus having gone through your 8th house for a little bit, it may have given you a bit of optimism when it came to a debt situation, perhaps. Or a lot of times when I see Venus go through I'll get to that when I talk about the 8th house later. But the 8th house is other people's stuff. Now the 9th house is what? It's spirituality. It's religion and philosophy. It's also the law, right? We see political values and idealism there, all that kind of stuff. So Venus entering in, oftentimes, right? Venus coming out of the 8th house can make us very sentimental and forgiving, and going into the 9th house makes us get to the deeper side of that, which is philosophical. So oftentimes we want to muse, right? We want to contemplate. We want to consider, the bigger picture. And we might be sort of accumulating new beliefs here and new values. We might have a change in our political philosophy, or we might find a new spiritual teaching or a mentor or a guide that we like. Maybe a new author, who knows? But something that starts to take your mind out of the personal and into the more universal. Or the deeper questions about existence and all that sort of thing. Now, Jupiter's been here for a while. So this has probably already been in the back of your mind for the whole past year. And then Jupiter going into your 10th house is more about expressing all that sort of stuff. Now, Jupiter in the 10th house, we often think about, again, career advancement. The 10th house is what you do, right? So career advancement and new opportunities that pop up. Now, sometimes that can mean drastically changing a job or career, which isn't always comfortable, right? So just be aware of that. This is a momentous year where everything is going to, or a lot will be focused on your life direction, including possibly changing that life direction. Now, Mars entering the 8th house after being in the 7th, sometimes we're really pissing off our partners when Mars is in the 7th. But then going into your 8th house, this is hard financially. It might put you more in debt. Sometimes by choice because, we do stupid things with our credit cards or we take on loans or whatever. Or sometimes because we have to. Like cars break down and we have to buy a new one and put that on loan. Or we could have a loss, right? A gambling loss or an investment loss, because the eighth house is other people's stuff, which it also includes investments. It might have been, it's your money that you invest, but the return on that investment is the money itself growing, right? From the value of whatever else. So we see investments there. So just be careful. Make sure you save money, because you might find yourself going more into debt. And be very careful. And we should move on from Virgo Rising to Libra Rising. So for our Libra Rising friends, this puts Venus in the 8th house, Mars in the 7th, and Jupiter entering the 9th pretty soon here. Now, Venus having been in the 7th may have been kind of nice, right? I think of it as sort of date nights, but it was still Aries, right? So it's still not the most comfortable expression of Venus. But Venus going into your 8th house, to me, it does something interesting psychologically. To me, Venus in the 8th house can make us a bit sentimental. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we start thinking about the shitty shit that we did to people, We think about when we were not very nice. We think about things that we regret. And it often encourages us or makes us feel like we want to make amends with people or apologize, or people end up apologizing to us. It's sort of like a burying the hatchet kind of thing. Because what? It's debt. The 8th house is often debt. And we're talking about squaring an emotional debt here. Forgiveness. Venus in the 8th house to me has to do a lot with forgiveness. Now, Mars in the 7th, though, that can spark ruptures in relationships, conflicts. Yes? It can make us resentful, or we can say things, or our partner can say things that we can't take back. And sometimes they end up causing breakups and stuff later. Now, my partner's Mars is going to be in their 7th house in a month or so. And then mine is going to be in my 7th house a couple months after. It doesn't always mean breakups, but it's something you have to be aware of, because it can make us act a fool. We say things that we shouldn't say, because in the moment we're upset and we get sharp tongues. Yes. Which is very Martian. Or Martial, or whatever. When I say Marshall, it makes me think of Marshall Mathers. Marshall Mathers. Eminem. Anyway. But you have to be aware of that. Now, Jupiter in the 8th house and going into the 9th, hopefully you saw some other things reconciled. Now, oftentimes it may have to do with things like inheritance, or having to deal with death in some way, or healing after a death. Sometimes we get a gift of money. That's another Jupiterian thing in the 8th house. But going into the 9th house, this is about you changing your mind over the next year. It's about a birth in yourself of a new perspective, of a new way of looking at things. You may find yourself getting involved in legal things, legal actions. You might find yourself getting involved in political work or activism, or find yourself, becoming an advocate for a certain cause or something like that. You could find your whole spiritual outlook also changing. You could get very interested or invested in a new philosophy, or perhaps teaching. This is also the house of universities, right? It's higher learning and education, also spirituality. So you could be going back to school, right? Back to school, like Billy Madison. I think more of university level stuff. But you see, this is a very optimistic time. It's a time when your mind is changing. Probably from learning regardless. But you could find yourself also having to teach people too. But in true Jupiterian fashion, make sure that you are following what you advise other people to do, that you practice what you preach. So let's move on to our Scorpio Rising Hermes. This is my partner, Scorpio Rising. So this puts Venus going through your 7th house. Jupiter's about to go into your 8th house. And Mars is in the 6th house now. So Venus going into the 7th house, especially after the 6th, because the 6th is, it's illnesses and, the stuff that we have to do, not want to do. Obligations. So Venus there hopefully was a bit healing, right? A lot of times I say it's a time to, improve your health situation. But going into the 7th house is so much more lovely for me because I love relationships and all that sort of thing. And Venus going into the 7th house, as I said earlier, to me is date nights. The 7th house is relationships, right? Particularly, our romantic relationships, our long-term partnerships, but it can be business partnerships and other things too. In ancient astrology, it was also adversaries, like sports opponents and things like that. But going into the 7th house here, I think of as good relations with our long-term partners. Sometimes we even meet a new person. We meet a new partner. That can be another possibility too. Right? But it also gives us a sense of wanting to be close. Right? It encourages closeness and enjoyment. Right? Venus is pleasure. And Taurus is also about pleasure and enjoyment as well. So this is a time really when you should focus on enjoying yourself with your partner and enjoying your partner. Doesn't mean you don't take time by yourself, but you'll really just, enjoy that sense of being with them. You might even feel like a pretty couple together, if you guys do, group things. Might be a fun time for that too. Pardon me. I'm just saying. Anyway, you should also take your girlfriend out, Take her out. Maybe some nice restaurants or bars or I don't know. But I think you should take her out. Anyway, you have to watch out for Mars going into the 6th house, though, because it can tax your health. Now, the 6th house, as I said, is the things that we have to do and not necessarily want to do. And Mars rejoices in the 6th house, you see? Which is good for you because it also gives you the gumption to get all the stuff done that you've been avoiding, right? Mars gets stuff done here. So make your lists. But the thing you have to be careful of is pushing yourself too hard, because then what happens? Then you get sick. And that's one thing you have to work to be careful of with Mars in the 6th house is burnout, which again can make you sick. And then Jupiter, right? In the 7th house, going into the 8th. Hopefully with Jupiter in your 7th house, you met a new partner. Hopefully you met a new partner, Scorpio Rising. Just, my partner, Scorpio Rising. And going into your 8th house will have to do with, sometimes it has to do with gain from death, right? That's why we see inheritances there. We see things having to do with wills and trusts. Yes, having to manage other people's money. It might not be all good. It might be a lot of expenses and stuff like that. But hopefully there's some sort of recompense that comes from all those sorts of things. Now, to me, it also has to do with forgiveness as well. But on a wider scale because it's Jupiter. So remembering those things that you've sort of resented yourself for. And those other resentful, or what you resent other people for. Yeah. And slowly letting go of that resentment. You might be faced with a lot of things and memories that you thought you forgot, right? And you'll probably be prompted to reconcile or want to reconcile some of those things. So just be aware of that. It's a very healing type of thing, right? Again, forgiveness. Forgiveness is the key word I think of there. Anyway, let's go on for our Sagittarius Rising Hermes. So for Sagittarius Rising, this puts Venus in the 6th house, Mars in the 5th house, And we have Jupiter about to go into the 7th house, right? So when I see Venus go into the 6th house, now, hopefully you had fun when she was in your 5th house, right? Because that's where she rejoices. That's the pleasure house. We'll get to that in a second. But Venus passing into your 6th house, it's not necessarily a letdown after the party. It's just the desire to get your stuff together, right? To organize a bit, to rest a little bit more. When I see Venus in the 6th house, I'm like, you need to improve your rest situation, your nutrition situation, and your sleep situation. Get more sleep. Take care of yourself, right? It's similar to the Venus in the 12th house thing, which is self-care. This is more about your health self-care, right? Getting better routines. That's why I say the best routines that we can manage under these transits are sleep, nutrition, and what was the other one? Sleep, nutrition, and exercise. Being somewhat active. And, not pushing yourself like Mars in the 6th house does, but being gentle with yourself, okay? You might find yourself healing from an illness too. That's another thing that happens. Now, with Mars going into the 5th house, especially after being in the 4th, that's usually fights with your parents. But going into the 5th house, to me, is fights with kids. Because the 5th house, it's pleasure and sex and all that stuff too, but it's also your children, because that's how they get made, right? So I think of fights with kids, first and foremost. Or we have difficulty or conflicts in situations involving our children, right? I've seen that quite a bit with this placement as well. So you might have to deal with an issue with their school or something, or they may have a bully, or maybe they're just really agitating to you right now. They just keep saying no, 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 no. That happens too. So you just need to be aware of your patience. The other side of this too is it makes us really horny. Makes us very amorous, this Mars in the 5th house. I have it in my natal chart. But it gives us a lot of desire in that area of our lives. So if you don't find an outlet for it with a partner or whatever, then you're probably just going to be really agitated. So find an outlet with yourself then, if you know what I mean. Because this will be important for you. It may also encourage some reckless behavior, Just watch how much fun you have. Because when Mars goes into the 6th house, it's going to be a hangover. So just be careful, you see. Now, Jupiter has been going through your 6th house, right? So maybe that whole health thing I was talking about has been a theme of the past year as well. And this time right now, it's just really in the focus, right? It's the tail end of Jupiter being here. So maybe this is when you're recognizing a lot of the good, results of the good improvements that you made. And then Jupiter going into your 7th house, hopefully, will open up new avenues with your intimate relationships. Maybe you make new commitment to a current partner. Maybe you end up meeting a new partner. Maybe if you're polyamorous, it's all of the above, like me, right? But this is a wonderful thing to be optimistic about, because it brings that area of your life a lot of joy and luck. So if you're already with someone, you could see that time just reflect the closeness that you both have together. And you especially, it could be an especially enjoyable year in your marriage or your partnership. Or it could be a time when you meet someone else. The other thing that I do see here, though, sometimes is it can be something beneficial that is also painful. Like breaking up with someone who's really holding you back and really causing you pain. I have seen Jupiter going through the 7th house indicate the end to a toxic relationship. Or going through that whole process. Sometimes it's a divorce. Because there are good sides to these splits, you see. So just something to be aware of. Anyway, let's move on to our Capricorn Rising friends. Our Capricorn Rising Hermes. So for Capricorn Rising, this puts Venus in your 5th house, right? Of children and pleasure. And we got Mars in your 4th house of home and family and, well, your private space, your origins. And then Jupiter's about to enter the 6th house of, health and obligations and all that stuff. So with Venus going into your 5th house, this is, the pleasure placement, isn't it? This is a lot of fun, right? Either we have harmonious relationships with our kids, right? We take them to Sky Zone or, I don't know, Disneyland. That's kind of a tall order for anyone these days, but, or whatever, roller skating. That's what me and my daughter do. We go roller skating. We both love it. But we also sometimes have fun romantic liaisons. This is pleasure in general. And I don't know about you, but I find romantic liaisons pretty pleasurable. So that's something we do frequently see. Venus rejoices in the 5th house. Yes? The 5th house partly gets its meaning from Venus, right? Venus rules sex and pleasure, just like the 5th house does. So she's rejoicing and enjoying herself. So really, I hope you take time to have fun. Now with Jupiter leaving the 5th house, I imagine the whole sort of past year had been about learning to have fun again, perhaps, right? Perhaps you'd been too dour with yourself for the previous year, right? But now this year, Jupiter going into your 6th house is about improving your routines. And that could have a lot to do with health, and it could have a lot to do with how you arrange your life. So getting your affairs in order, right? Organizing yourself. That may involve organizing your home. It may involve getting yourself financially organized. I'm not sure. Jupiter also rules your 12th house, right? And your 3rd house. Anyway, I see it as you bringing order, right, to your life and improving your health routines. Maybe it's a time when you finally decide to start exercising. Maybe it's a time when you finally get a health problem looked at. Either way, take advantage of this time because it's critical for you to get yourself back on track. You may have felt reckless for a little bit. And now it's time to sort of exercise some wise self-care. Now, Mars going through the 4th house. I often think of this as starting problems in our private spaces. It could really, very literally be things breaking around the home that you have to repair or replace. It could be fights with your landlords or mortgage companies or things like that. We could see our land, our physical land or home damaged in some way. We could also see more metaphorical things like breaks with the past, splits from our roots, cutting off family, going no contact with a parent, perhaps. Fights with our fathers, rejection of past identities, things like that. Rejection of our roots in some way. I don't know about you, but my ancestors were assholes for the most part, so. But this can be a tumultuous time because it reflects the fact that your private space is in discord, right? So a big thing here is learning how to take time for yourself and to reason out how you feel, okay? And not just react too quickly because you could see yourself cutting things or people off that you might regret later. So anyway, now let's move on to Aquarius Rising. This is me, Aquarius Rising. Yay! I got Pluto conjunct my ascendant right now. So much fun. Now this puts Venus in our 4th house, right, of private stuff. And Mars in our 3rd house, right, which is siblings, extended family, communication, education. And then Jupiter's about to go into the 5th house, which is pleasure and children and fun. Yes. So I'm looking forward to that. But Venus going through our fourth house is a time when we actually get more attached, or not even attached, but more in harmony with our roots. Our focus goes on our private space. Sometimes we want to decorate. Yeah, this place is a mess. I need to do something. I need to change some things. But that's a frequent theme, is wanting to bring beauty to your space, to your home space. You see? And sometimes we see relationships with our parents improve, particularly a father, but it can be both parents or grandparents even. If, if you're not as old as me and they're no longer alive. But Jupiter having been in the fourth house too, hopefully brought some luck from your roots or your past, right? Also, it can indicate generational wealth. So you may have gotten lucky from something that your dad did at some point. Or you may have gotten more interested in your roots, your genealogy, things like that. Or your parents may have had improvements in their health or whatever. But now going into our fifth house, this is exciting. Now, it could be lucky stuff for our children, right? Our children could have a better time or experience more luck or whatever, which I love that for my daughter. But it could also represent more fun and pleasure for us too. So, again, romantic liaisons. I mean, that's what I'm interested in from the fifth house. I'm typically mostly interested in one thing, and that one thing's in the fifth house. So, but it's not just sex and pleasure, although hopefully it is. It's also enjoyment in general, right? You could see yourself enjoying a new sport or a new hobby, right? You could really focus on something that's fun for you, right? In the fifth house, we see things like performance, and that's where it gets the creativity thing too, because making kids is a creative act. Oftentimes, we want to explore our artistic side, take up a craft, something that you might start a new hobby at this time, right? I know for me, it's going to be learning about having to have fun again after, really wedging myself into just routine for a long time. But then Mars going into the third house, right? After having been in the second house, we may have had to spend a lot of money. But going into the third house can be fights with family, particularly siblings, cousins, aunts, or uncles. So watch out for that. But on the other hand, it can also be a lot of energy behind communication projects and things like that. When I think of Mars in the third house, though, the number one thing I think of is road rage. And I'm telling this to myself too, because I have terrible road rage. I'm awful with this, So please slow down, take your time. There's no reason to rush around with your errands and such. It's better if you don't, because if you get in an accident, that'll be even a worse time for you. Even if you don't get hurt, all the financial nonsense and insurance bullshit, right? So take care of yourself, please. Don't rush, don't get angry, and don't scream at people from the car, right? Because who knows what type of people they are, what they have in their car, right? Or what they're capable of. Like some dude pulled up behind me. I didn't realize they were just a couple of 20-year-olds or something. But they got right on my behind. And then they pulled up alongside me and I yelled, I cussed at them. And I'm like, that was a bad idea. I mean, that could have gone way worse, So don't do stupid stuff like I did, okay? And I hope I don't do further stupid stuff this month, So, anyway, the other thing about that is if you're involved in an educational project or pursuit, don't let yourself get discouraged here, because that could happen as well. Okay? It often just is minor setbacks, and you'll work on it later. You'll see things improve. Anyway, let's move on to Pisces Rising. Yay. Oops. Pisces Rising. Now, you poor folks, you have Saturn going through your first house. I hope you enjoy it. I know I sure did when it was in Aquarius. So, big changes, right? But this puts Venus in your third house, right? Of siblings in your local area and education. And then Mars in your second house of money. And Jupiter's about to go into your fourth house of family and private life. Anyway, Venus going into your third house can improve relationships with your siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, that sort of thing. They may pop back up in your life. If one of them, maybe a female or woman, right? Family member reconnects. But in general, this is about reconnecting with them. You see? You could also see yourself get some improvement or progress, right? Advancement or progress with an educational project or pursuit. Excuse me. Whereas Mars in the third house, like Aquarius Rising is having to deal with, that's a sharp tongue, right? Venus in the third house is a soft tongue. And I don't mean like that. You know, it's about encouraging people. It's words of encouragement, right? Everyone's favorite love language. I mean, not everyone, you know. It's like my number second. But it's words of encouragement oftentimes. You know, we can be a little bit quicker intellectually as well. You know, it's not about debating, but sharing ideas. Yes? Sharing ideas. I think of people hobnobbing and talking, or talking after class, or meeting with the professor, or something like that. And with Jupiter here, hopefully you've seen some luck in that area as well. But Jupiter going into your fourth house, it could be luck for your parents, sure. But oftentimes what we see is luck that comes to you from your parents or from your home situation. Sometimes we can find a new living situation. We can buy a new home. We find a new apartment. Or we just have general happiness or joy around our living situation. I mean, it's not always good. Sometimes we have to sell a home or a piece of land, which can be a pain. So there's that too. But typically I think of Jupiter in the fourth house as a lovely time, right? It's where we get more connected to our roots. We might find ourselves just more frequently in the home. I know for the last year or so, you know, I was frequently in my home. I was working a lot, but I enjoy my home. You know, my apartment. I like my apartment. It's a lot nicer than my one that was back in California. So, now, but Mars going into the second house, especially after being in the first. In the first, it encourages us. You know, it encourages us, right, to puff up and be boisterous, right? We're sort of like, yeah, I could do that, right? Sometimes we get overly confident. But see, then that goes into the second house. And sometimes we're overly confident about our financial situation as well. And we spend too much money, don't we? I always say Mars going through the second house burns a hole in our pocket. Now, for me, it wasn't, I just had this. And it wasn't so much about, you know, me just spending money willy-nilly. It's that I suddenly had to pay things, right? Like I had to pay money to the IRS, right? Like I owe money to my sister. You know, I had like 3 big medical bills just hit me in the face out of my mailbox. It's funny, it's like in true Gemini fashion, I'm like, well, maybe if I don't get the mail, it'll just go away. You know, I wish. Not that lucky. So anyway, just be careful of that. Be careful with your money. And enjoy this time when you're going to be a bit more eloquent and diplomatic, perhaps. And then enjoy Jupiter going through your fourth house. Hopefully, it's improvements to your home and living situation and not so much having to change them. Anyway, that's all the rising signs. I'm sorry this was terribly long. It's like an hour. But you got a lot of good horoscopes out of it, and you're not going to watch the rest of the stuff anyway. So, I'm Saturn Girl, and I always say, I love you. You're beautiful. And have a wonderful whatever it is you're having. And don't forget to like and subscribe, please. And click the bell, right? So that you get notified when my new videos drop. And also, please tip me. Not just the tip, but you know what I'm saying. Super thanks below. And also my Patreon link is over here, over there. And I love you.